Hello everyone. It is far too late for any reasonable person to be doing a January wrap-up. Good thing I am not a reasonable person. As you can see, this is much more laid back than my usual setup. I'm just filming on my computer here with a very cheap webcam. I've been thinking about how to do wrap-ups, and I've not come across anything good. So we're trying this out. We're going to try and do a tier ranking of everything I read in January. The idea being that it'll accumulate throughout the year and just maybe provide something a little bit more interesting rather than just me talking about the random books that I read, is talking a little bit about it with the spice of a tier ranking here. So, apologies if this ends up being horrible video and audio quality, but we're trying something new here. So, let's talk about the books that I read in the month of January. So January was a pretty good reading month for me. Read a couple of books that I really liked. A lot of things that were just okay. Nothing that was out and out bad, which is always good. But yeah, we're going to go over that here. There's quite a bit of a variety here. But the first thing we're going to talk about is actually in January, right at the beginning. Most of this was read in December, and then a little bit in January. I finished up a series that I've been reading for years now, and that was The Dark Tower by Stephen King. I was reading The Dark Tower by Stephen King back when I was dating my wife, and my kid is almost a year old now, so it's kind of wild to think of just how long I've been reading this series. Would read it for a while, then would put a book down, and never stayed consistent with it, and finally realized if I don't finish Song of Susanna and the last book, I'm going to forget all of that context that I had, so it's time to wrap it up. So I read Song of Susanna late last year, and then finally finished up with The Dark Tower. For context, King fans, I know a lot of King fans will defend the length of his books. This last book in The Dark Tower is just a little bit shorter than The Stand. This is obscenely long. This is a ridiculously long Dark Tower book. I'm not always one to criticize authors for, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that, like, oftentimes authors are doing things intentionally, or at least I like to believe that they are, and if something is really long, I like to believe that there's a reason for that. This book, The Dark Tower, this last book, has some of the best stuff in the entire series, has some of the most interesting and weird things that Stephen King does in the entire series. And there's a sequence in this book. I listened to it on audio, but in print it's probably 100, maybe 150 pages. There's a sequence that is so bad, it is so insufferable, that if this was not book 7 in a series, if this was book 3 in a series, I would have stopped it. I would have put it down and said, that's enough of that. Well, I didn't, because it's book 7, and now we're dealing with sunk cost fallacy. So I finished it. If that section had not been in the book, this probably would be my favorite book in the entire series, just for how gutsy King is with so much of what he does in this book. But there's a big chunk of it that was weighing it down. For people who have read it, and we'll keep it spoiler free here, but for people who have read it, it's a portion that's dealing with, I'm trying to remember the word for it, was it an asylum? And there's a portion that deals with, like, the staff there. For no reason. We just go on with these people for an obscene portion of the book, rather than being with our quartet. Having said that portion aside, King is brilliant in this book. I don't tend to... I'm not a King superfan. I don't think he's not an author that particularly impresses me as on a craft writing level. But I read him for the weird and out there ideas, which is not the greatest reason to read an author, but for King, it's been endlessly compelling. And with the Dark Tower series, I have never read a series quite like this, where I literally had no clue what would happen when I turned the next page, or when the next chapter would roll around. And that happened to the nth degree in this 7th book. The way things end for so many members of the quartet, is magnificent. The ending of Jake Chambers in this book, the way his story arc wraps up, amazing. Like, one of the best things in the entire series, maybe the best thing in the entire series. That whole sequence with Jake Chambers, and just the big conclusion to his arc and where it all ends up going is amazing. I've never read anything like that. And only an author with the guts, the kahunas of Stephen King could pull it off. And then also, Roland's ending was great. And for people who have really dug deep into The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, and they really sank their teeth into it, there are some really uncanny similarities between some things with Severian in Book of the New Sun that he realizes near the end of that series, and the way Roland's story ends in The Dark Tower. So, I don't know where to rank this one. I'm going to be honest. This, depending on how I feel over time, this might change. But for now, we're going to put it in very good. I liked this book a lot. I liked 80% of this book an incredible amount. But yeah, there's things about it. If Stephen King had had a more ruthless editor, this would have been a much better book. So, the next book we're going to talk about is Aurelia by Stephen Wahed. At this point, viewers of my channel are probably sick of hearing me talk about the Pendragon Cycle by Stephen Wahed, of which this book is a prequel novel, so I'll just say in brief. This is a prequel to Wahed's bigger Arthurian retelling, the Pendragon Cycle, and this tells the story of King Arthur's grandmother and how she got positioned to be in a place in leadership, in royalty, as it were, so that King Arthur could come about in a few generations. Wahed in this series deals a lot with the ideas of generations and legacy over time, and the impact that a few key decisions will make and have a ripple effect downstream for your descendants afterwards. To be honest, when picking up this book is published by Baen Publishing. It just got released in January, and Baen sells their arcs to anyone who wants them. So I purchased an arc of this and was able to read it, and then Baen was, the people at Baen were kind enough to send me an actual copy of this book, and it's great. You guys should get it. But when I heard that this was what the prequel novel is, I kind of had that reaction of the guy from Guardians of the Galaxy, where he's like, who? Like, who was Aurelia? She's not a main character in the big series. So I was like, what? She's the one we're getting a prequel novel of? Why not go back to, like, Atlantis and, like, before everything in the series? So I wasn't sure what to think of this one going into it. And Wahed is not an author who writes with a lot of, like, action or driving momentum to his books. But this book was great. This book was amazing. It's very cozy fantasy in the sense that The Hobbit's cozy fantasy, or Name of the Wind is cozy fantasy in the sense that it's got like a slow pace through a beautiful and magical world. My wife's standing observing from the corner. Hey baby.
Hi.
Do you need anything?
I was going into the bedroom.
That's okay, you can go.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it's got a great, like, slow-moving pace to it, very deliberate pace to it, but this is not a book that will blow people's socks off in the sense of, like, whoa, I read things I've never seen before. But the profound things that Wahed is trying to say in this book, the points that he makes through the character of Aurelia, and seeing, like I talked about, the way that she lives nobly, and that she makes the decision to live with virtue and kindness and walking in the truth, that affects an entire nation, because it creates people who can lead the nation well and righteously, really was moving seeing that. So I really liked Aurelia a lot. I'm not necessarily sure if this is going to be an all-timer, but it's excellent. This is truly an excellent novel. And if you guys haven't read The Pendragon Cycle, you can start with this novel. I like Taliesin more, so I'd probably recommend starting with Taliesin, but if you want to get on like the new cutting-edge novel, yeah, you can read Aurelia. Next up we have here is The Bloodstones by Tori Tekken. So I am going to try and read more self-published fantasy this year, so I'm trying to read more. And I love Tori, I love her channel. I don't know her personally other than commenting on some of her stuff, but I was excited to read The Bloodstones. And lo and behold, The Bloodstones is very, very good. This is a great book. So yeah, we're just gonna drop it in very good there. This book is like if you combined the Dothraki portions of A Game of Thrones with what was the other comparison that I made? I'm not sure, but it's like fighting, training, warrior school, other things. To me, it felt very Asian inspired. That was the other comparison. Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. I can't remember Tori's reading timeline. I don't think she had read Long Price Quartet by the time that she wrote this book. But I'm not surprised that she loved that series after reading this. I've only read a bit of Long Price Quartet, but even so, this feels very much akin to it. So if you like Daniel Abraham, read The Bloodstones because it has a very similar feeling in terms of puppet masters pulling the strings subtly in the background, and the action heroes aren't actually the ones who are in control or the ones with power. There were some things about this book that I'm excited to see how they develop in the future. And it's not like this book puts a bow on everything. This is not a self-contained novel at all. It is very much a book one. So maybe it would go in excellent if a few more things were tied up, or if I had a bit of a clearer thing. And there's a big reveal at the end of the book. And to be honest, I think I missed the forest for the trees a little bit, because it was something that was supposed to be shocking to every character around them. It's on like the last few pages, and I was kind of left going like, wait, who is that? What happened? So I was a little confused there. That might be on me. But just for the time being, we're putting this in very good. If you want to read a self-published fantasy novel, The Bloodstones is great, and you guys should read it. Next up, we have The Stress of Her Regard by Tim Powers. So I frequently take book recommendations from some of my favorite authors. I like reading the books that they love. Christopher Rocchio is an author who has provided many an excellent book recommendation. He sings the praises of Tim Powers and has said that this is his favorite Tim Powers novel, The Stress of Her Regard. This book is a secret history novel, which is a lot of what Tim Powers writes in, from my understanding, which is sort of like there's different mysteries or anomalies throughout history that he will then write in supernatural or fantasy explanations for why those things are. So in this novel, it's about how the Romantic poets, many of them, like Keats and Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, many of them died under very weird circumstances. And so Tim Powers comes up with what those circumstances were and why they died. So many of them died so young. And the answer he comes up with is vampires and the Nephilim and the Greek muses all being sort of forged together in this big plot. So I really enjoyed this book. This book is very much like we talked about the Shelleys and the Romantics from that era. So this is from the era of Frankenstein. Shortly after that, from the era of Dracula. This book reads like it was written in that era, with some of the digressions, with some of the smaller or slower parts. So I don't know that this will work for everyone, because it is quite a long novel for what it is. But I really love this. Tim Powers understands symbolism and the use of symbolism in this story, unlike very few authors that I have read. So, for example, one of the opening scenes of this novel is a young man is on his way to go get married, and he's bringing the wedding ring, and he's going to go meet up with the bride and her family, and they're going to have the wedding. And the night before the wedding, he stops at a tavern with some of his buddies. They're drinking, and they go out to do something out in the stable yard, and it's dark and stormy and raining, and he needs to go help one of his buddies who got stuck or something. And he's like, oh, dang, I don't want to lose my wedding ring that I got for my wife. So there's a statue standing nearby, and he slips the ring onto the statue's finger, and then goes helps his buddy. And when he comes back to retrieve the ring, the statue's hand is closed. And like already, like that just sent pure chills down my spine. Like that is what I want out of a horror novel. I don't want to be grossed out. I don't want to not be able to sleep at night. I want the feeling you get from a ghost story, that slight uneasy, that uncanny feeling. And so you think of that like on a symbolic level, what just happened there? It's like, oh, that's brilliant, and Tim Powers knows that. So there's stuff like that all throughout this book. He brings in like weird marriage rituals from, I think, either England or Ireland into this story that work really well. He understands vampires very well and what makes vampires work. Shortly after reading this, I watched the new Nosferatu movie, and the one thing frustrating about that is like how the vampire is dealt with, because it's like it starts to fall apart in terms of the symbolism of what vampires are, and Tim Powers doesn't. He knows what vampires are. There's also some really excellent crucifixion symbolism in this novel. So, if you guys like symbolism, and if you don't, like, this is still a very spooky, enjoyable, uh, secret history fantasy novel. So you can just read it on that level. But if you really want to dig deep into this, great stuff in the Stress of Her Regard. So this is excellent. There's there is a world in which this is better than Aurelia. Right now, I'm going to keep it there though. Very, very good. Next up, and we have another excellent novel here, and this is The Sunset Limited by Cormac McCarthy, now the infamous Cormac McCarthy. So McCarthy is kind of a controversial author, not just because of his personal life, which things have been coming out about more recently, but also he's very polarizing. A lot of people deeply hate his work, and some people love it. Just look on BookTube. You'll get people who have read every novel that he's ever written, and then you'll get really, really high prominent reviewers who cannot stand his stuff. I fall somewhere in the middle where I've liked some of the books that I've read by him, and then some have just really not worked for me. The Sunset Limited is a novel in play format. It's really just a play, but it's published as a novel and advertised as that. And it is one long discussion between two men, a college professor who's a white man who just tried to kill himself, and a black man who saved him from killing himself, from throwing himself in front of a train. And the professor is a nihilist, and the black man is a devout Christian. And the black man brings him back to his home, and they just have a long discussion on the meaning of life, and well, really that. And this was great. This was brilliant. This is probably the best writing I've ever read in a McCarthy novel. I don't know that I like this more than No Country for Old Men, which right now is my favorite of his, but I might. I still have to watch the movie of this, but The Sunset Limited is great. It'll take you about an hour and a half to get through, maybe 2 hours at the most, but it is thought-provoking. It is the best portrayal of nihilism I've ever read in a book, and McCarthy does not shy away from the really, really difficult questions that this poses. So once again, we're going to put this in very good. Yeah, we're going to put this on at the top of very good. By the way, we're going to put Bloodstones in front of Dark Tower there. The Sunset Limited was excellent, and if you want to read Cormac McCarthy for his philosophy, for the tough discussions, for the darkness of his mind, as it were, The Sunset Limited is a great place to go, and it doesn't have some of his more questionable writing things in his prose, like the lack of punctuation or some of the extreme violence. Anyway, next up here we have The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. So I made a video about this, so I'm not going to talk about this one quite as much here, but The Dying Earth is just okay. This has not aged as well as a lot of other books from this era have. If you read Edgar Rice Burroughs, Burroughs has aged much better than this book by Jack Vance. It's got a lot of interesting ideas. Once again, if you want to know my full thoughts, you can watch the video on it. It's got some really good world-building things in it, and it inspired some of the best fantasy and sci-fi out there. But for what this is, for me, this is just okay. As is Sharp Ends by Joe Abercrombie. I did not love this. It was okay. Some of the short stories here are really good, but this is a short story collection by Joe Abercrombie. But it's not really. There's a lot of short stories in here, but really a good 2/3 of the short stories here are all just one novel that's split up and has other short stories interspersed, because a bunch of them are connected about the same character and their adventures. And I didn't care about that character. I think it's the weakest character I've read from Abercrombie. And so this one just didn't work for me, which is rare for Abercrombie, because I've liked all of the books that I've read of his and loved most of them. So yeah, didn't love Sharp Ends, but it was sort of the necessary evil to get to Age of Madness. Next is Riven Earth by Zamar Amir. So once again, trying to read more self-published fantasy. Riven Earth is that. This is an elemental fantasy novel about a kingdom that lives in this massive, deep forest, and well, it's about a lot of things, but it's about the aftermath of this war that happened between the dryads of the forest and a king who tried to free the kingdom from under the oppression of the dryads. It's about the fallout after that king. I believe after that king has died, and about his son having to step up and become a leader when he's a very passive character who deals with a lot of depression. The best thing I can say about this book is this book has the best portrayal of suicidal depression and what it's like to battle suicide that I've ever read. Um, maybe with a few exceptions, but it's one of the best that I've read. There's some weird structure things in this book, which I didn't make a video review for this, but I have a full written review on my Goodreads, which you can check out. And some of the weird structure things that the author did here did not work for me. Some of them were really interesting for the first half of the book, but once we got into the second half of the book, I felt like it sort of lost the plot a little bit. And so we're just going to leave this in good. I'm interested in reading the sequel. I don't know when. And the author actually messaged me after I wrote my review and said, hey, some of those problems you talked about, I think I got them ironed out in the sequel. So I look forward to seeing how the story ends, because it's very well written. His prose and his use of language in this novel is great. And a lot of the ideas are great, and many of the characters are well written. But some of it just didn't come together like I wanted. Okay, the next book is Undine by Frédéric Delamont Fouquet. So one of my goals this year was to read some more classics. I grew up reading classical literature, but haven't stayed consistent with it, and there were some really big holes in my classics reading journey. So my goal is to read at least one classic every month. So for January, it was Undine. Undine is really a novella. It's not a full novel, but it was an inspiration to Gene Wolfe, George MacDonald, and H.P. Lovecraft. So I read it. This is a gothic fairy tale story about, and it's also an inspiration to the original Little Mermaid story. It's about a knight who falls in love with a water creature, a feminine water creature. There's not a ton more to it than that, other than to say it's gothic and has some very dark gothic elements that you don't expect in those types of fairy stories. This is just okay. Once again, it's interesting, it's short. If you're interested in reading a short gothic novella that inspired all those things, Undine is not a bad option. I'm not putting this in not good, but it is just okay here. Next is The Mechanical by Ian Tregillis. So this was part of a buddy read that I was very happy to be a part of with Alan from the Library of Alexandria, Pete with Ponderings of Pete, and then a Nuclear Katie. And we had a discussion on Alan's channel. It was great. If you haven't watched it, you should. You can get a lot of my thoughts there. But The Mechanical is an alternate history in which the war between Protestants and Catholics in the Middle Ages sort of took a left turn when the Protestants developed mechanical automaton robotic warriors that can fight for them. And the Catholics didn't develop this technology, and so they fled to the New World to avoid religious persecution. And the Protestants have sort of taken over Europe, and the Catholics have settled in Canada. So this has some really fascinating world-building things in it. One of the big questions is the question of free will, whether or not humans have free will, and certainly whether or not these robots have free will. So move aside our Scott Baker, we've got another person debating the question of free will in fantasy. And Ian Tregillis does a great job. This is a very well-researched novel. It's well-written. It's interesting. My favorite point of view in this book was the point of view of a character named Vassar, who's a Catholic priest who's undercover in Europe as a Protestant pastor. So he's a spy. And some of the things that he goes through and some of the things that he sees and experiences were just gripping, were haunting. This book is in many ways, has a lot of the themes that you see in sort of like gothic horror novels. This is not scary like horror, but the question of what does it mean to be human, free will, things like that that you'll see in books like Frankenstein, or Dracula. They're here. So I really liked the mechanical a lot. We're going to put this at the top of very good. I really, really enjoyed this. I look forward to seeing where the series goes. I actually tonight started book 2, The Rising, and this is a completely unknown series other than Alan, and I know he had this on some of his TBRs way back in the day. I've never heard anybody talk about this book, and I don't know why. It's great. Maybe because it's marketed badly, but it's a great fantasy novel, and more people should check it out. Next, and the last book that I read in the month of January is The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. So I'm historically not a person who would ever read horror, just not really interesting to me, and in a lot of ways it still isn't. But specific novels that are marketed that way are of interest to me. The Exorcist being one of them. This is about, for two people who don't know what The Exorcist is about, it's about a mother who's a famous movie actress, and her daughter, for some pretty unknown reasons, gets possessed by a demon. And so it's about the mother trying to figure out what's wrong with her daughter. If is there some medical reason behind it? A lot of the book, a lot of it, is spent on trying to eliminate medical reasons for what could be wrong with Regan, the little girl. And eventually, this atheistic, rationalist actress mother has to turn to the only people who will listen to her, which is the Catholic Church. And that's why it's called The Exorcist. It's about Father Karras. Once again, you want to talk about like symbolism in a story? The priest is literally named Karras. I mean, pretty powerful symbolism there. This is a book. Blatty was a Christian. He was a Catholic. And so, in some ways, this is a perfect book for Christians because it's about priests fighting against a demon, fighting against the devil for the soul and the physical life as well of this little girl. And yet, this is a book that a lot of Christians hate and a lot of Catholics hate. And that is because Blatty is mercilessly unflinching in his portrayal of evil and the demonic in this book. In how twisted this demon is, and how foul this demon is, and how much this demon just wants to destroy everything innocent and precious about this little girl. And personally, I make the argument that it's necessary. Because as soon as you start sugarcoating the demonic, then you get, and I literally heard somebody say this today on a YouTube video that I was listening to, where they said, oh, people access the divine through the occult and through demonism. And it's like listen to yourself talk. You access the divine. You access what is holy by enacting or by interacting with the profane, by interacting with the demonic. That's an oxymoron. And so as soon as you start coddling, or as soon as you start putting pretty painting over how evil and how demonic these types of things are, suddenly you get this confusion. So I think Blatty, what he did was necessary in terms of how he represents this demon that's inflicting this little girl. But it's really hard stuff to read sometimes. It is galling in just how blasphemous this entity is. But what would you expect? And the ending of this novel is incredibly powerful, and it wouldn't be otherwise. I really loved this. It's not a perfect novel. There's some problems with it. If I were writing this, I don't think I would have written it quite as ruthlessly as Blatty does, but I liked it a lot. And I'm actually going to put this in all-timer. Yeah, maybe it's my favorite book of the month. We'll name it that for now. But this was a great novel. It affected me deeply. The fight of these priests, one of which is losing his own faith, who doesn't even really believe in exorcisms but is there, and of the older priest who's sort of mentoring him along, who's approaching the situation like, in many ways, in a Christ-like way, knowing that this is his march to Calvary. Yeah, just fantastic novel. Even if you're not a religious person, I know I'm using some religious, mumbo jumbo here talking about this novel. I think you'll find this very compelling, just for the clash of good and evil, just for the very human story that it tells. So even if you're not religious, I recommend you check out The Exorcist. So anyway, guys, those were the books that I read in January. Let me know if this is a good format. Who knows? Maybe this didn't even record any audio and I'll need to redo it all, or it's all choppy. But I thought I would try something a little bit different here. Let me know what you guys think. What did you read in the month of January? Should I keep doing this for February? Should I switch it up? Let me know what you guys think. Thank you all so much for watching, guys. Take care.